Hello, everyone. It is great to have you join us today for another really important JStream webinar that is focusing on annexation in advance of the July 1st date, after which the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has the ability to bring forward to the cabinet and the Knesset annexation of parts of the West Bank for annexation. And so as I'm sure you all probably know, we're doing a series of webinars on annexation, and today's webinar is a part of that. It's going to be focused on the reaction of the Arab world to annexation. And I should introduce myself. I'm Debra Shushan, the Director of Government Affairs, and I have two great guests with me today who will be discussing this issue with us. I will introduce the two of them, our two guests. We have Ksenia Svetlova. She is a senior research fellow at the Interdisciplinary Institute, or Center rather, Herzliya. She's also senior policy fellow at the Mitvim Institute for Foreign Policy. Ksenia's specialties are expertise in Egypt, Middle Eastern affairs, as well as radical Islam. She was a member of Knesset from 2015 to 2019 with the Zionist Union, specifically a member of the Hatznua faction led by Tzipi Livni. While she was a member of Knesset, she was a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, as well as the Aliyah and Absorption Committee. Before coming to the Knesset, she was a writer and commentator on Arab news for Channel 9, the Jerusalem Post, BBC, Kommersant, which is a Russian outlet, as well as others. Through her journalistic work, she has had the opportunity to visit many Arab countries, including Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Bahrain, the UAE, Egypt, and Malaysia, an Islamic country. She covered the war in Iraq from a U.S. battleship in the Persian Gulf and has many years of experience working in the Palestinian territories, and published exclusive articles from Tahrir Square during the Egyptian uprising. We also have with us today Dr. Shibley Telhami. Dr. Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, specifically in the project on U.S. relations with the Islamic World, the Center for Middle East Policy, and also their foreign policy program. In the past, Dr. Telhami served as a senior advisor to the U.S. State Department, an advisor to the U.S. mission to the UN, an advisor to Congressman Lee Hamilton, and as a member of the Iraq Study Group. His wide-ranging expertise is in the Middle East, Arab politics, and shifting political identities in the Arab world. Importantly, he also regularly conducts public opinion polls in the Arab world, Israel, and the United States. So he very much has his finger on the pulse of public opinion in all of those arenas. His publications are wide-ranging. They include The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East, The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, and the best-selling The Stakes, America in the Middle East. I want to thank our two panelists, very distinguished panelists, for joining us today. It's wonderful to have such experts joining us to discuss this really important issue. So I just want to note, for those who are really interested in this topic, that a couple of weeks ago, we did a related webinar specifically focused on Jordan and its reaction to annexation. So for folks who are interested in that, I really recommend going to jstreet.org/jstream, where you can find the video on that webinar with Dr. Marwan Mouasher. We may discuss a little bit Jordan today, but because of that previous webinar, it won't be the focus of our discussion. Before we get started, which we will in just a second, I want to let all of you know that your questions, as always, are welcome we will have audience Q&A toward the latter part of the webinar. So please do go to the Q&A at the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Click on that at any time during this webinar and submit your questions for our panelists. And I will be happy to take as many of those questions as I can and put those directly to our panelists. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to our two panelists and give each of them some time to give opening remarks. And we are going to begin with Ksenia Svetlova. Ksenia, over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Debra. Shibley, it's great to meet you online again, and hopefully we will be able to do it in real life sometime soon. And also, thank you for everybody who gathered to talk about this important issue, because we know what is going on in the United States. Very dramatic events, and therefore I think it's very touching for us Israelis, and also for the Palestinians, of course, that there are some people in the US that still take the time and invest it into exploring furthermore of what is happening in this part of the world, and they're concerned no less, perhaps even more, than we are here. So I would like just to start and to tell you about the initiative that we former members of Knesset that support peace and support the two states initiative took just yesterday, and it will be developing in the next few days. 25 former lawmakers from Israel, from left and center-left parties, signed a letter that warns about the dangers of the annexation and its implication for the region, for the Israeli-Palestinian arena, for the relations with Arab countries, but also for the relations of the US with its Arab allies here in the Middle East. And of course, we support any lawmaker here in US, a Senate or the Congress, who will be speaking openly against this move. And we encourage also all of those who would want to take this step and to explore more about it, and perhaps also voice their opposition to such a development, to do it, because we do not have time. The annexation, even if it's not about to happen at this moment, and I will expand more about this right now, the talk about annexation is damaging enough, and this is what's important to understand. It's not only about the deed, whether the annexation will actually happening in the 1st of July or at 13th of August. We don't know exactly when and if at all. Why we are not sure, though the Prime Minister promised us time and again that this is a done deal. He has the support from the White House, and by the 1st of July he will be going to the legislation and also the cabinet decision, and we'll be introducing this basically and promoting this move. I have to tell you from personal experience that sitting for 4 years in the Committee for Foreign Affairs and Defense, what I felt from Netanyahu himself, that came as then he also served as a foreign minister, and he was obliged to come to the committee and brief the members of the committee on foreign affairs, on regional affairs and security and so on. Each time when he was confronted by somebody from the more right-winger parties than Likud, from the Jewish Home, for example, and he was asked, so why do we not opt for the annexation? It was in 2015, 16, 17. Annexation only became part of Netanyahu discourse by the end of 2018. Until then, for 10 years, he did absolutely nothing. He did not annex 1 inch of the Palestinian land, and he did everything possible to take off the table any legislation that was submitted to the Knesset by members of his own party or by members of the Jewish Home and other right-wing parties. So I felt, from his tone of voice, by not explicitly his words, but by what was the meaning of his words, that he understands better than anybody in this country what are the dangers of the annexation and why it's better for Israel to, let's say, continue manage the conflict. And this is something that Israel is doing under Netanyahu now for many years, managing the conflict, but not rocking the boat. Annexation would be, it will mean rocking the boat, okay? So it was very strange for me to hear during 2019, when he said that, well, you know, when I'll be reelected, we will go for the annexation. It also sounded a little bit like, all right, okay, so maybe it's just a election promise. It's nothing more than election promise. But then he, you know, he kept talking about it. He kept talking about it time and again. And still, nevertheless, he's talking about it now for almost 1.5 years, okay? We felt, many of us felt in the Knesset, also members of his own party felt, that it's in a way, it's a tool, it's a political tool to combat those who oppose him from the right, like the Naftali Bennett, the leader of Jewish Home, now the leader of Yemina, and Ayelet Shaked, and perhaps those who are in the ultra-right of Israel. But he understands very well, like we all do, that this move will be very damaging to our relations with Jordan. It will also undo all of the achievements that were achieved during the last 4 or 5 years in relations with the Gulf countries. And the Gulfists are not keeping silent. They are talking about it loudly, and we heard it many times in the last few weeks, specifically from Abu Dhabi direction, but also from the Saudis, that it's not gonna be, you know, accepted, and then they're not gonna be keeping silent about it. Okay, so what does it mean for Netanyahu, who is every single day talks to Israeli people and tells them about how great our relations are with the Gulf? This is something that he made kind of a card, you know, the winning card that he presented many times in the recent years. And I want to share with you one of the consequences of our study in Mitvim Institute that we conducted by 2017 and 2018, when we asked the Israeli public, which Arab state do you think is the most important for Israel, security-wise, you know, economy-wise? The people's answer was, surprisingly, it was Saudi Arabia. And, you know, I connected directly to the importance that was given to this country and to other Gulf countries by our prime minister. So in the end of the day, so many Israeli people believe that it's not Jordan, with whom we share, you know, 38 kilometers of border. It's not Egypt, with whom we fight against Islamic terrorism in Sinai Peninsula, but it's rather remote countries with whom we barely have any communication. We do not have, you know, diplomatic relation with this country. Yes. So Netanyahu cherishes this friendship with the Gulfists, with the Gulf states. He believes that it's crucial for Israel to fight together with them against Iran, and now he's going to ruin it with his own hands. So something doesn't work here. Something doesn't work in this formula. Saying that, I will just conclude my words, and I will say that I still have a feeling, although, you know, we can be surprised, of course. We can be just, you know, wake up one day and we will see that the bill of annexation is going through 3 readings in the Knesset. It can all happen in just 1 week. You don't need a lot of time when you have the obedient Knesset and no opposition whatsoever to say that, you know, they will not allow it, and you know, they will just lay in the entrance to the Knesset, and they will just not allow this to happen. So it can happen very quickly. I still, though, have a feeling that something might come in between Netanyahu and this annexation move. He might present it as the unwillingness of the White House to move along. He might also say that it will be damaging at this stage, you know, for our relations with the Arab states, specific Arab states, not all of the Arab states that you know, are not important to him, but specifically the Gulf states. The relations with the Gulf states, it's to, you know, just stress it again, it's his winning card, and I do not. It's hard for me to you know, grasp that he will endanger, you know, this kind of a winning horse that he presents to the Israeli public time and again as one of his greatest achievements in foreign policy.
Thank you so much for that, Ksenia. I'm now going to turn to you, Dr. Telhami, for your remarks. Take it away, Shibley.
Thank you, Debra. Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure for me to talk to this group. Let me start with a couple of things before I address the central subject, which is how the Arab world is likely to react. One is to point out that I currently today have a piece in Foreign Policy about annexation, but it tackles how the American political elites have dealt with Israel's Jewish democracy, and how this annexation is likely to impact that in a critical way and raises profound questions about the meaning of Israel's Jewishness. I invite any questions about that, particularly from people who may have read this piece. The second point I want to make is, the question before us was, can Israel get away essentially with annexation and normalization with the Arabs at the same time? I think I need to point out that whether or not Israel can survive any limited reaction in the Arab world isn't the core issue. It is one that is on the table that I'll address. It is important to point out that annexation is illegal, it is unethical, it violates fundamental rights of the Palestinians, it increases the prospects of tension between Arabs and Jews in Israel. It is plain wrong, regardless of how the rest of the Arab world reacts. So let's start with that. So we need to keep mindful of those principles in the long term, not just focus on, who's going to react how. This is just fundamentally, profoundly wrong. And as I say in my piece today, it raises even more profound questions about the nature of the state of Israel, including to American political elites in the long term. So now let's get down to the actual question about how can Israel get away with normalization and annexation. The short answer is no. Okay, unless you mean that the relationship between Israel and Egypt now and Israel and Jordan now is a normal relationship, as if there is normalization, that you can get along with Arab governments, but there's always constant tension with the population, as exists between Egyptians and Israelis. In fact, the relationship arguably is more tense between Egyptians and Israelis than it was 15 years ago, arguably. And the resentment of Israel in Egypt is arguably more tense than it was 15 years ago. If this is what you mean by it, of course, it's conceivable that Israel could have a relationship with Arab governments in that regard. But let me address two things even related to Arab governments, and then I want to talk about Arab publics. With related to Arab governments, there's no question that Arab priorities have shifted, particularly after the 2003 war, the rise of Iranian influence in the region, as well as the Arab uprisings that have scared a lot of regimes and have really made them much more focused on, saving themselves in power and addressing their immediate strategic interests. And that undoubtedly diminished the importance of the Palestinian questions to them. It's not that it was a top priority for them to begin with, but this clearly reduced its importance, in their views. And therefore, they have been more willing to set it aside to deal with other priorities, including confronting Iran for the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and including their own domestic security issues, and therefore to be more cooperative certainly with the US, but even with Israel. That is a strategic reality that certainly has taken place. But here, I need to tell you two things that may not be absolutely obvious. One is that despite that shift, and obviously that explains why Israeli leaders feel optimistic about this relationship that is emerging with Gulf states, you have to remember two things here that are not as obvious. One is the fact that this is in part a function of the Trump administration, an administration that is an aberration in American history, that is not likely to repeat itself. And what I mean by that is you have an administration that has been prepared for the first time in the history of the United States to put all the powers of a superpower, politically, financially, and to use its muscle to implement an agenda that is helpful to the Israeli right wing, even one that is ideological, even one that pitches a biblical interpretation of what Israel should be like, or what the boundaries of Israel should be. We've never had anything like that. We're never likely to have anything like that, that a superpower uses its muscle with all its partners, including the Arab states, including the Gulf states, certainly at the UN, as we've seen, to implement that agenda. So yes, there's muscle that is being used, and part of the reason why Arab states are playing is because of this muscle that the United States is using. It's not just because of their natural relationship with the US. They see the relationship with Israel as an asset with the Trump administration. Yes, it's an asset regardless. As I said, there is a strategic environment that shifted, but they're prepared to do more because of this arms race. The second thing is you also have to understand how the Trump administration has handled this issue. Not only have they made it a priority and packaged it from the outset as something that is broad, that has to do with Iran and has to do with Arab-Israeli cooperation in the context of quote, the deal of the century, but they have never shared details with Arab states about what was on the table until the very end. And frankly, Arabs were surprised. They would give them loose things like, oh, there will be the plan would have a Palestinian state on the table. The plan would have East Jerusalem as a part of East Jerusalem as a capital of Palestine. Of course, those were really there as in name, but they weren't there in practice. But they were Arab states were never given full details at the very end, which is one reason why it rejected. But by now, it's too late for them and too costly for them to pull out of this project. And therefore, while they may not, embrace it, they may acquiesce in it to the extent that it might happen. But I obviously they were not doing it in love. They're not doing it with embrace. They're doing it in an environment which is not likely to repeat itself and may not repeat itself as early as November. So keep that in mind. This is a strategic picture that is unique to America that could change any moment, and I think will change. And therefore, priorities will shift, and the nature of relations will shift, and so forth. So even with Arab governments that have strategic incentive to cooperate, this is not likely to endure. Now, let me just get very quickly to public opinion. As many of you know, I've done a lot of public opinion studies over the year, and I've termed historically the Palestinian question as the prism of pain through which Arabs see the world. And I think it was up until really the period after the Arab uprisings, which have shifted not so much that Arabs now don't embrace the Palestinian cause, or Arabs now warmed up to Israel, but it is just that they have so much more on their table, that their own daily survival, their own domestic politics, their own struggles with regimes, their own struggles with each other, their own struggles to survive, literally civil wars in some cases. Obviously, the Palestinian issue has not been a top priority issue, but there is no evidence whatsoever, and up until at least polls that I've looked at 2 years ago, there was no evidence that there's any shift at all in the way they fall on this issue. That is, they still support Palestine, and they still see Israel more of an enemy than as a friend across the entire Arab world. There is no evidence at all that this has shifted, despite campaigns on social media to indicate that may have. People will cite somebody on the social media, or a campaign on the social media, or a Saudi or an Emirati or someone who's making those kind of voices. They are there, undoubtedly. I have no doubt. What is the percentage of population? I haven't done recent polling, I can't tell you. But I can tell you there's absolutely no evidence that there's been a major strategic shift. And one way we could tell is a place like Egypt, where, of course, the public discourse hasn't shifted at all on this issue. To the contrary, the prospect of annexation is making Egyptians more angry, even though the regime wants to maintain a very close relationship with the Israelis and is maintaining a close relationship with the Israelis. Certainly that's true of Jordan too, but Jordan, you touched on it before, but of course it has a huge Palestinian population, has a completely different issue. So, but what I'm saying here is public opinion, in my opinion, hasn't shifted, even despite attempts to get them on board. I can't say it never shifts. Of course it could shift, but there's no evidence of that at this point, that it has shifted. And I don't see any anchoring principles that would incline our public opinion to shift. One final point on public opinion. Do not ignore the fact that annexation is being blessed in the American discourse and the Israeli discourse based on biblical claims, not on international law, not on moral grounds, on biblical narratives. And that, as I said, you might be able to get, Israel might be able to get away with it in the short term, But just think ahead. I don't care if state nationalism becomes stronger in the Arab world. Egyptians feel more Egyptian. Well, it didn't really happen after 1979 as people thought it might. It has a little bit, but people still feel Arab and they still feel Muslim, and that's not going to change. Their faith and their identity will shift a little bit, but the core that anchors who they are isn't going to shift. And to think that the idea that Muslims and Arabs are going to acquiesce in a Jewish state using biblical claims to control land they think belongs to them is something that is going to be accepted in the long term. I think, you're not living in the real world. That is not the real world. I'll end with that.
Thank you both to you for those really, for those great comments, which really give us all some food for thought. I will just remind our audience that if you go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, you can go ahead and submit questions, as some folks have already done, which I appreciate. Please do try to keep your questions focused on the subjects that we're discussing on today's webinar. That would be very useful as you formulate your questions, which we look forward to getting to. So one question that I'd like to put to you is the subject of regional organizations and the role that they have played and the role that they may play in terms of conveying opposition from the Arab and the Arab world and also the Muslim world. We have, of course, key organizations like the Arab League, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There's, of course, joint action by Arab and Muslim states in the United Nations. What role do you see for those regional organizations?
Is this to both of us, each of us?
Shibley, why don't we start with you?
Okay, so let's start with the two big ones, the Arab League and the OIC. Now, they, as you know, instantly took positions rejecting Trump's plan, something that was not expected at all, because as you recall, part of the narrative that the Trump administration created immediately, everybody is supporting. They tweeted, we're getting, all the Arabs are supporting it, everybody's supporting it. They had all sorts of lists that they put on, only Iran and the Palestinians are rejecting the plan. And suddenly, very quickly, the Palestinians go to the Arab League and the OIC, and then we have one in Cairo, one in fact in Saudi Arabia, two meetings that have completely rejected the Trump plan formally. So that should tell us something about, in a way, at least how governments feel, because these are organizations of states. These are the very states that have to make the deal with Israel, that even they're so worried that their read of Arab public opinion and Muslim public opinion is not with them on this. And that's why they have to at least have the cover. So that should be an indication in and of itself about where their own read of public opinion is, right? That's very clear in those episodes. Nonetheless, these are really not important moves, in part because the Arab states, do pay lip service in those things, essentially to acquiesce in to accommodate public opinion. But the Arabs also, the publics don't take these official statements very seriously. I mean, they expect them to accommodate them, but they don't take them as indications. So it's hard to see, any real teeth coming out of these organizations because they're still dominated by the powerful states in the system. And so in that sense, the interests of those states, in the case of the Arab League, obviously mostly the Saudis and the Egyptians at the moment, and also allied states like the UAE and so forth. But those are the ones who will say that where you find more regional organizations that are really kind of citizen organizations, like lawyer organizations, journalist organizations, those are all, weighing in on the Palestinian side of the equation. And that's more telling about where the public is, frankly, than the official state organizations.
Ksenia, did you have something that you wanted to add on that?
Yes, well, so I can tell you that in Israel, the perception of the regional organizations is that sometimes the fume and the disagreement, with the steps of American administration or Israeli administration, it's being channeled through these organizations, which do not really have any real influence in a real power. And this is exactly what happened during the presentation of the Trump initiative. So absolutely none of the Arab leaders had the courage to come up and say, listen, this is not a good initiative. We do not support it because it doesn't give really any kind of state to the Palestinians. It will just not happen. Okay, so what they did was sending their ministers of foreign affairs to Cairo to have this Arab League meeting, and unanimously they denounced the Trump plan. And where were the kings and the presidents and the prime ministers? Okay, so forget about it. So what I'm saying is that we'll probably see a harsher tone from the direction of the Arab League. I don't know what we will hear directly from the presidents and ministers who really dependent now much more than yesterday from the United States. We are talking about Egypt, that it is a very dire situation. Okay, so also Jordan, they each day they add something to the threats, but we do all understand that they're being also pressured by Washington. So the situation is not very simple there. So I think that it's a big probability that we will hear no, and even like very harsh statements about. After all, it's not the American administration here; it's an Israeli move. So the tone will be very blunt, and we will hear more of what we heard in the 90s perhaps and in the 2000s. But the question is really what will be happening in the Arab capitals themselves. I totally agree with Professor Telhami that the Arab street still has a weight, and that the hands of the many of the Arab states are tied exactly because of the views of the Arab street. So otherwise, we would see already by now in Israeli, in Riyadh, certainly in Manama, and also perhaps in Abu Dhabi, and it's not happening. It's not happening for a reason, because there is still, disagreement, from the side of the ordinary citizen. The BDS is actually getting stronger in the, countries like Egypt. People we never heard about BDS. Okay, so we heard, of course, anti-normalizations. All of the trade unions were always against any kind of normalization with Israel. But the BDS movement itself, so it's boycotting the, artists who are performing in Israel, like Beyonce, or who it was it Jennifer Lopez. This is something that is still maybe, not to the extent to, have this total rage like in the years of the Second Intifada, but yes, definitely enough rage to keep this, the regimes, kind of nervous, and have to consider also what the public says, what the people say.
Thank you to both of you for that. I'm going to start. We have a lot of questions that are coming in from our audience, and I encourage more at the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. So I'm going to start weaving in some questions for the audience. I do want to pick up on the subject of Egypt, which both of you have mentioned. Obviously, a very important player here. Egypt has a 40-year peace treaty with Israel, which of course was a huge turning point in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so I'd like to ask you, and this question comes from Avraham Sporegan, whether Cairo might actually cancel its peace treaty with Israel if de jure annexation goes ahead. Jordan has been much more out front than Egypt in terms of opposition to annexation, in terms of King Abdullah talking about grave consequences for the relationship between Israel and Jordan, talking about all options being on the table. We haven't heard this kind of rhetoric from the Sisi regime in Cairo. What's your take on what might happen with the peace treaty? You both know a heck of a lot about Egypt. Ksenia, I'm going to give it to you first, but I also want your take on this, Shibley, as well.
Yeah. So it seems to me today, and of course, the prophecy is for fools, but given the very special nature of relations between the Egyptian president and President Trump, I think that the probability of cancellation of the treatments, it's very low. It's extremely low. Of course, any reaction of the Egyptians, of the Jordanians and Saudis, Emiratis, also it will be curved out from the Palestinian reaction. So it will depending of what will be happening in the West Bank. And if there will be nothing, I personally do not believe that we'll have nothing, yes, but if that will be the Jerusalem, the embassy in Jerusalem scenario, when actually, nothing happened. The sky didn't fall. Abu Mazen also did everything possible to prevent from the, new intifada, new wave of violence, protests and so on. So if there will be no major developments in the Palestinian territories, why should Cairo, be canceling this agreement? So there are many diplomatic steps in between, having normal relations right now, even cold, but still normal, and between canceling the Camp David agreement. They can withdraw the ambassador. They can expel the Israeli ambassador. There are also, a set of tools that it's very well known to us. And it really, I think, depends of A, what will, Donald Trump do? B, what will the Palestinians do? What will be happening in Egypt itself? And also, with the overlooking with, what is the reaction of the other Arab states?
Well, as you know, I've my first book was on the Camp David Accords, and I go to Egypt very frequently.
I know I stole my advisor's copy of it. I'm not sure I ever gave it back. Ellen Lesta-Okar stole her copy. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, please go.
It's an issue that obviously I follow very closely. I care a lot about what happens in Egypt, and I've been writing about it for a long time. The short answer is it's improbable unless there are some, a lot of developments that happen. We've seen the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty tested immediately, almost, after Sadat was assassinated, and then Israel invaded Lebanon. And that was obviously huge, where the Israelis are at war with the Palestinians, with the PLO, and the Egyptians held on to that treaty, even though it was a fragile and new and post-Sadat. You have a military establishment in Egypt that places great emphasis in the strategic military relationship with the Israelis. It also survived during the Morsi's reign as president. In fact, it was argued that the Egyptian-Israeli military relations was very, very close, even during Morsi, maybe the closest they had been, in large part because of their coordination over Gaza and the Sinai. But so I think it'll push the administration a lot, but frankly, let's put it in perspective, and in a way I'll use this to answer a broader question. Why aren't Arabs revolting over Israeli annexation of Jerusalem and so forth? And as if this is really the measure of where the public is. It's such a silly argument. It's a silly argument because, of course, revolts happen, but they rarely do. Not only, of course, is the Palestinian question isn't the top priority for Egyptians or anyone else. It doesn't mean they care about it. You could read, you could see where they are, but it's not top priority for them. But they're not revolting over existential issues. They're not revolting over things that matter to them every single day, whether it's food or whether it's Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, you can argue that the Muslim Brotherhood got, quote, only 25% of the Egyptians voting for it. That's 25 million people. And they're now, a terrorist organization, and their existence is on the line, and they're not revolting out on the streets. Now, of course, there's an answer why they're not revolting on the streets in any of these countries, not just the Muslim Brotherhood, but opposition. But it has nothing to do with Palestine or it's important to them. So let's keep that in mind, that the governments obviously have found ways to keep, the pressure on the public and preventing the uprising. Learned a lot from what happened in the Arab uprisings. They think they figured out a way to prevent them from exploding the way they did in 2010 to 2011. And they're doing that on all issues, not just on the Palestine issue. I don't need to remind you what some governments are doing to their opposition. So, the point here is that no, I don't think that the Egyptians are likely to shift unless there's a big eruption somewhere that puts a lot of pressure on them. They could freeze, they could complain, but it's unlikely that they'll break a relationship.
Thank you to both of you. So we have questions about a couple of other key Arab states that I'm going to package these two questions together. I do want to encourage our audience, in addition to any questions that you want to submit, if you have questions about the reaction of particular Arab states that you'd like to pose to our panelists, please feel free to do that. So one of the questions that we have, and I think it's a really interesting one, is about Syria. The question comes from Rabbi Mark Dworkin. And, in pointing to Syria, we're talking about an actor in the past, before the uprising in Syria in 2011, that was such a major player in the conflict with Israel, was a hardline state, the beating heart of Arabism. And of course, now it's in complete disarray. And so Rabbi Dworkin's question is, how does chaos in Syria impact annexation? And the second question regards Jordan. And the question is, given that King Abdullah needs Israel's help in various domains, is there really a chance that Jordan will take serious action, like for example, with regard to revoking its peace treaty? And that question comes from Aviva Meyer. Shibley, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go.
Yeah, well, let me start with the Jordan one because it's really an important one. I think it's, to be honest, the king is in a bind. I was in Jordan talking on this issue at a conference and talking with officials just before the travel ban because of the pandemic. I was there, a few months ago. And this was a really, really hot issue, in part because it's not only because they can have a public opinion issue, but because you're going to have ramifications. They can see the writing on the wall, so to speak. Because if this plan is implemented, there will not be a Palestinian state. If there will not be a Palestinian state, demand for a Palestinian state will not stop, or there could be a third intifada. And then they face two things. One is that extreme right in Israel could revive Jordan as Palestine, and two, that there could be expulsions of Palestinians from the West Bank into Jordan that also can increase the tension. And those things seemed improbable just 2-3 years ago. Now they seem like they're not too improbable. So their fear is genuine. At the same time, in the short term, the king is dependent not only on the Israelis for cooperation, more importantly, on the Trump administration. And the Trump administration is using muscle and threats behind everything it does to get people in line. And so how he navigates that space is very tough, where he registers how important it is. He talks to the president, he conveys to the administration his fears, why he opposes, but at the same time, his options are limited. And that's why I think this is probably the toughest place if there is annexation, particularly if it includes the Jordan Valley. It's going to put him in the toughest place he's ever been since he's, taken over the throne. So yeah, I think that's really a tough one. I certainly wouldn't want to be in his shoes. As for Syria, here's the oddity about Syria. In fact, the interesting thing is when Syria was a unified country and was projecting, quote, military strength, actually it was the easiest country for Israel to deal with because they were so sensitive to deterrence. Even in Lebanon, they would never go through a particular line that was established tacitly because there's a big asymmetry of power, as we can see now, of course, in the relationship between Israel and Syria. And the Assad regime obviously didn't want to disrupt his stability and his control. So Israeli deterrence was remarkably effective. They could read them like a book. They had a tense relationship, and politically the rhetoric was heated, but it was a very predictable relationship, both in terms of limits to which the the regime would go and the limits to which Israel would go. Now, of course, there are no limits, in part because they don't have full control over the territories. There are a lot of groups they're dependent on, like Hezbollah and others, that have saved them. And as a consequence, their leverage is weaker. Their ability to control what happens on the territory and respond to Israel is weaker. So, of course, they're not going to accept the annexation. They're going to use it rhetorically, but they're not likely to do anything they wouldn't do now in terms of their operations. It'll galvanize some people behind them, certainly behind Hezbollah. But I don't think it'll shift the military. But here's the interesting story when you ask the question at the beginning, is normalization possible with Israeli annexation? Think about this. It's not going to be possible with Egypt. We're only asking, will they keep the peace treaty? But obviously the public isn't going to buy into Israel. The Jordanians aren't going to buy into Israel. We're asking whether Jordan is going to be, even be able to survive it. The Syria is not going to buy it because that obviously is, and they're not going to, be warmer to it. So Lebanon is not going to be. All of Israel's neighbors are going to be worse off in the relationship with Israel. Israel is going to be worse off in the relations with all of these countries. And so the only one we're asking about is, Ksenia said earlier about how the focus is on Saudi Arabia. It's really the Gulf states and principally Saudi Arabia, maybe the UAE. And the question is, are these shifting? I want to say one thing about the Saudi Arabia, and I understand the government has to look after its national interests. Of course, every government does, and they have priorities, and one understands it. But keep in mind that when we did public opinion polls in 2012 in Saudi Arabia, Saudi nationalism was the weakest of all Arab states, meaning people were less likely to identify with the state as Saudis than in any other Arab country. The biggest identities were Muslim first, Arab second, and Saudi third. Now, this could have shifted. I haven't been testing it. I don't know, but it would be a dramatic shift if they were able to reverse that in 8 years.
Okay. So I would like to add to that, fascinating what you just said, Professor Telhami. What I can just add to it, that perhaps on Syrian issue, first of all, let me remind you that Jerusalem was annexed when Syria was, defeated in the 73 war, but still a unified, strong state, and one that was contending to be one of the leaders of their world, yes, because Egypt was boycotted, or so it was called a boycott, but it was not really a boycott. We know that there were normal relations behind, the scenes, as usually there are, and yet, Israel, surprisingly, and without, further ado and discussions and debating the issue, just annexed Jerusalem and put an end, to this story. Of course, it was not recognized, but you know what? Also, an regional war didn't start, and it was Jerusalem, So when today, I think what is important, perhaps, what influences this whole boldness, of Netanyahu's governments, it's this feeling that the Arab world is weak. It's in a disarray. It's in its most vulnerable place, perhaps, since the, beginning of the 50s, since the age of the, national revolutions, and, building, the new regimes. This is perhaps what makes Netanyahu be so confident. Although, again, he is very intelligent person. He knows the regional system very well. He also have met, unlike many Israelis, even the, chief of staff and so on, he've met personally. Generals, he've met ministers of defense, foreign ministers, presidents, princes, and so on and so on. Okay, some of them officially, some of them non-officially. So he knows all of that. But perhaps this understanding that there is no unity in the Arab world. There was no unity. Yes, okay, never. But there was some, visibility of some joint action. Today, with everything that is happening, and Syria is a, good example for that, because Syria is very damaged. Okay, it has no infrastructure, it has no economy, it's living horrific economic crisis right now. Israel what? Israel did what? Palestinians do what? So there will be statements, there will be, I don't know, maybe demonstrations in Damascus, but then what? You know, people here know that, you know, people in the right wing know that. It emboldens them, you know. So this is this feeling that you have different states that are not united, they're fighting against each other in the end of the day. And they, all of them, they're dependent much more today on the United States than they were in the past. Okay, so this is, I think, what, you know, basically makes people believe that they can get away with this. Okay, it's a wrong assumption. They cannot get away with this, and we know that there will be serious consequences. But when Netanyahu prepared the ground, you know, for this move for the last year and a half, and every time that he was talking, he was making this point of the Arab world is weak. This is first. They are fighting with Islamic terrorism. They are fighting against Iran, and they are sick and tired of the Palestinians. And if we are looking at, you know, media campaigns in the Gulf, specifically in Saudi Arabia, then the recent campaigns that they waged in the Nakba Day, Laisa Qadiyati, okay, this is not my issue. That is not my struggle. This is not my problem. Okay, this is a clear example that Netanyahu has some point in what he says. Again, I think he's overstretching it. Okay, so if he will really go for the full annexation of the 30% of the West Bank, even the wonderful new friendship with the Arab Gulf states will not help him. And again, we are not bordering with Saudi Arabia. We are not bordering with Bahrain. We are bordering with Egypt, will be in a horrible mess. And we are bordering the Jordan, which will be a mess. And Egypt will, perhaps the treaty will stay, but definitely it will be more, difficult, I think, for the Egyptian regime to make excuses of why it's continuing to have good relations with Egypt, and it's not really a good situation for us to have. So I'm talking, of course, now about the, security reasons and governmental issues, but of course the background of this is of course the moral failure of the current government, that, and also of the opposition, that the opposition also doesn't talk at all about the moral objection to the state of annexation. They are talking only about security, and they are talking only, if at all, yes, about okay, so we will lose the Arab states, we will lose Jordan. Okay, so what about the rest of it? What about doing something that is deeply against the core issues, core values of Israel as a Jewish state that was established in '48, against its declaration of independence? Okay, against everything that many people here believe, about 50% of them. Again, this is something that is just not happening at all. There is some discussion, limited, I would say, of dangers from of deterioration of security, perhaps new intifada, perhaps the collapse of Jordan regime. But again, Netanyahu completely, he masterminded this game with the public opinion, Israeli public opinion, and this is why Jordan is not an important Arab country, and Saudi Arabia, it's number one in the priority list of the average Israeli. So voila.
All right, here we go. It's time for the lightning round. Are you ready, panelists? We have just a few minutes left. I'm going to throw a few questions at you, and please just briefly comment on the things that you want to talk about most, because we have a lot of interesting questions here. So I'm going to throw them at you quickly. 2 questions on Palestinian reactions. One of them is specifically directed at you, Shibley, if you'd like to comment on that. It's from Shlomo Orr. Is it best for Palestinians to simply accept annexation and then fight apartheid? Ksenia, maybe you might address the impact on security coordination and the government functions of the Palestinian Authority of annexation. We have a question on the US reaction from Bill Ruff, who asked, how did Trump so badly misjudge the reaction from Arab states to the Trump plan? And finally, for either of you who'd like to comment on this, there's an interesting question from Marsha Franklin about the impact of the Black Lives Matter protests here in the United States, whether that's resonating in Israel and in the Arab world in terms of a reaction to annexation. So we just have a few moments. I'm going to turn to Ksenia, to you first. If you could just quickly comment on anything there that you want to comment on?
So very quickly, I think that the Palestinians will not agree to annexation, and it's not good for them to agree for annexation because they know very well that they will not get any rights in the so-called one state. So they will be closed in their Bantustans, and this will be the end of it. Okay, there will be no civil rights for them, no political rights for them. You know, this is simply not attainable. You know, we see what is going on. The classic example is, of course, what is happening in East Jerusalem. The situation there deteriorates. You know, civil rights wise and everything else. On the function of the Palestinian Autonomy, I would say that. Well, you know, the Palestinian Autonomy is relieving Israel from taking care of the civilian population in the, you know, occupied territories. So we have the 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 million of Palestinians who need their water, they need their electricity, they need their medicine, and they need to send their children to school. So if there will be no Palestinian Authority, let's suppose that, you know, Abu Mazen puts, you know, the keys on the table and says, okay, I'm done. No more. We're canceling all the, you know, the Oslo Accords. That means it's an enormous burden for the Israeli government. I don't think that Netanyahu really aims for that. I think that for him, Palestinian Authority is his best friend. He can curse Abu Mazen as much as he wants. It's just a political game because deep inside, he knows very well, no Palestinian Authority. He has to feed all of these people in the West Bank that he hates so much.
Dr. Telhami, over to you. You're muted.
Let me answer quickly two questions, the one on the Palestinian reaction, the one on Black Lives Matter. The truth of the matter is the Palestinians were put in no choice but to reject the Trump plan, period. I think once Jerusalem was taken off the table, it was political suicide for them to accept it. And frankly, what's being on offer in the plan, quote, as a Palestinian state, nobody really thinks is a Palestinian state. In fact, as an exercise in the poll, I haven't released yet, so I'll tell you what it says now, where when you tell the American public, here's what the plan offers, about only 8% call that a state. So, you know, I mean, it's silly to call it a state, but just it's a name. So I think they know. The question is, what do they do about it, obviously? And now you saw probably an article in the New York Times about there are obviously some debate saying, let's focus on equality in one state. But the Palestinian Authority is under probably the conclusion that if this should happen, they would make Israel feel the burden of the occupation by withdrawing a lot of the responsibilities. They don't have a plan. It's hard for them to figure out how to proceed. It'll put them in a bind, but that's not good news because for anybody, because I think, having, no choices is somebody will fill that vacuum. Unfortunately, not good news for the Israelis. I mean, so certainly not good for the Palestinians either, but that's where we are because they were put in that position. In terms of Black Lives Matter, I really want to say something here that I think is important. Not only in terms of our own country and having to be responsive to this the desperate need for us to do something about the fact that after centuries, African Americans are still being humiliated in our own country in the 21st century America. So that should stand on its own. It's something that whether you're a Jew or an Arab, whether you care one way or the other about the question of Palestine, this is one of the big questions of our day. It's a value issue. And yes, there are people in the Arab world who are linking it to the issue, including Palestinians. Obviously, it so happened that the Israeli police shot a young man in Jerusalem mistakenly, and that clearly created roughly the same time a certain kind of solidarity. And you will see, George Floyd's picture on various things in the Middle East as a symbol. This has been a global movement. It's not just an American movement. But I want to say something bigger than just the moment related to African Americans, which, as I say, it should stand on its own. We are now in a values war. it is a values war. That's why you see, it's not just African Americans who are revolting, everybody is revolting. You see more whites than African Americans, and it has resonated in countries that are authoritarian, in countries that are democratic. It has resonated in East and West. It is a values war. And that values war is anchored on the fact that we are having already a deep values war in America, Trumpism versus the rest. And the George Floyd story is at the core of this value conflict, Trump versus the rest. And you know what? The Israeli government, in its coalition with Trumpism and implementation of this plan, paints itself in this values war exactly in the wrong place of where Americans are and where much of the world is. And that is a historical moment that I think will be noted when it takes place, if it takes place in July.
On that really powerful note, I am so grateful to our wonderful panelists, Professor Shibley Telhami, Ksenia Svetlova, former member of Knesset. It is so wonderful to have both of you join us today, and I'm really happy that we did end with that question and with that very powerful comment by Dr. Telhami. So with that, I'm going to let everyone go. I tremendously appreciate the audience joining us. My apologies to those whose questions I wasn't able to get to. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.